Why does a helicopter pilot hesitate when given a direct order? What makes a 26-year-old woman override a three-star admiral's command in the middle of a war zone? The answer sits somewhere between courage and calculation, between duty and defiance. And in Afghanistan, on a day when the desert wind tasted like copper and fear, Lieutenant Cassandra Brennan was about to learn the price of both. The Black Hawk shuddered through Afghan airspace like something broken but refusing to quit. Inside the metal belly, Cass pressed her back against the vibrating wall, eyes locked on 6 Marines across from her. Young faces, too young. Their first real deployment, and already the desert had taught them what fear tasted like. The pilot's voice crackled through her headset, words that turned her blood cold. LZ hot. Multiple contacts. Ground commander says hold position. She keyed her mic. Say again. Hold position, affirmative. Ground commander ordering all inbound units to hold at Rally Point Delta. Wait for armor support. Cass glanced at her watch. Rally Point Delta was 14 minutes out. The unit on the ground didn't have 14 minutes. She'd heard the desperation in the initial distress call. 4 dead already. Wounded commanding officer. Squad pinned down in a compound with walls closing in and ammunition running low. 14 minutes might as well be 14 hours. Negative, she said, her voice level final, we're going in. The pilot's response came after a pause. Lieutenant, that's a direct order from command. I heard the order, Cass said. I'm countermanding it, put us down. Silence on the comms, then quiet but certain the pilot's voice. Roger that, 60 seconds. In the troop bay, the Marines watched her. She could see the question in their eyes, the doubt. She was 26 years old, a woman in a world that still wasn't sure women belonged in places like this. A combat medic who talked her way into tactical officer school and now led mixed-role units that the old guard called experimental. She stood, gripped the overhead rail, looked each of them in the eye. No pep talk, no false courage, just 3 words, lock and load. The Black Hawk dropped fast. Desert floor rushed up through the open doors. Dust devils spun across the landing zone like angry ghosts. The moment the skids touched earth, Cass was moving. Boots hit ground. M4 carbine up and ready. 30-round magazine seated, selector switched to semi-auto. The compound was 200 meters northeast. Sporadic gunfire echoed off mud brick walls. She could see muzzle flashes from second-story windows. Hostile fire accurate enough to keep heads down. Her radio squawked. The voice was rough, panicked. Any station, this is Sentinel 2 actual. We are combat ineffective. Code down, 4 KIA, need immediate extraction. The transmission cut off. More gunfire. Cass ran. Behind her, 6 Marines followed without question. Strange how that worked. How doubt vanished the moment someone moved with absolute conviction. She'd learned that from her father's journal. Colonel Declan Brennan had written it the night before his last mission in Desert Storm. Leadership isn't about being right. It's about being certain when others can't be. She'd been 3 years old when he died. Never knew him. Only the words he left behind. The compound walls loomed closer. Bullet impacts kicked up dust to her left. She didn't slow, didn't flinch, just adjusted her angle and kept moving. Behind her, the Marines laid down suppressing fire. Controlled bursts, 3-round patterns exactly as she trained them. The compound entrance was a shattered wooden door hanging on one hinge. Cass went through low and fast. Cleared left, cleared right. The interior courtyard was chaos. 2 bodies in American uniforms lay motionless near an overturned supply crate. Another Marine sat against a wall, hands pressed to his stomach, blood seeping through his fingers. His face was ash gray. In the center of the courtyard, a Navy corpsman knelt over a figure in officer's insignia. The Captain Reeves, unconscious, shrapnel wound to the chest. The corpsman's hands were shaking. Cass dropped beside him. Report, he's not breathing right, trachea's crushed or blocked. I don't know, move. She pulled her aid kit. The captain's throat was swelling, airway compromised. Standard tracheotomy procedure required sterile conditions, proper surgical instruments, trained medical personnel. She had none of those. What she had was a field knife, 2 steady hands, and about 90 seconds before brain damage became irreversible. Above them, rounds punched through the second-story windows. The Marines had taken positions, returning fire, buying her time. She could hear them calling targets calm, professional, just like she'd taught them. Her knife was sharp. She'd made sure of that, always kept it sharp. The blade cut clean. The captain's body jerked once, then stilled. She inserted the hollow pen tube she carried for exactly this purpose, taped it in place. Artificial airway, not pretty, not textbook, but air moved through his lungs again. His color started to shift from gray to pink. The corpsman stared at her. How did you know how to do that? Later. Get him stable for transport. I need to secure this position. She moved to the stairs. The second floor was where the wounded were making their stand. 5 Marines low on ammunition. One with a leg wound that had soaked through his tourniquet. They'd been holding this position for 40 minutes. Faces streaked with dust and dried sweat. Eyes that had seen too much too fast. The senior man, a sergeant with 20 years on his sleeve, looked at her like she was a hallucination. Who the hell are you? Your ride home. How many hostiles? 15, maybe 20. 3 buildings to the north. They've got us locked down, not anymore. Cass moved to the window, scanned the sight picture. 3 buildings, flat roofs, perfect firing positions. The enemy had them in a kill box. Standard insurgent tactics. Pin the Americans down, wait for darkness, move in for the finish. She keyed her radio. Overwatch, this is Brennan. I need eyes on 3 structures northeast of my position. Immediate threat assessment. The voice that answered wasn't the pilot. It was deeper, older, carrying the weight of rank and 40 years of service. Lieutenant Brennan, this is Admiral Hawthorne. You were ordered to hold position. There it was, the voice from her nightmares, from her career file. Admiral Richard Hawthorne, 3 stars, commander of the Regional Task Force. A man who'd made his opinions about women in combat roles very clear in multiple congressional testimonies. Sir, ground situation required immediate action. I have 4 KIA and multiple wounded. Request air support for extraction. Negative. Air support is allocated elsewhere. You will hold position and wait for the armor column. That is a direct order. She looked at the Marines around her, at the sergeant with the 1,000-yard stare, at the kid holding his leg together with gauze and prayer, at the bodies in the courtyard below. Sir, with respect, the armor column is 14 minutes out. We won't last 14 minutes. You should have thought of that before you disobeyed my order, Lieutenant. Hold your position. The line went dead. The sergeant was watching her. They were all watching her, waiting to see what she'd do, whether she'd fall back on regulations and rank and the safety of following orders, whether she'd choose career over lives. Cass had her father's pistol at home in a locked case, Declan Brennan's service weapon from Desert Storm. Before he deployed for the last time, he'd written one line in his journal that she'd memorized. Sometimes the right choice costs everything. Make it anyway. She turned to her radio man. Call in the medevac. Tell them we're bringing out 9 wounded and 4 KIA. Hot LZ, I need them here in 6 minutes. Ma'am, the Admiral said. I know what he said. Make the call. Then she was moving out of the building across the courtyard. The Marines from her Black Hawk had set up a perimeter. Good fields of fire, disciplined positioning. She'd chosen them well. Listen up, she said. We've got 6 minutes until our ride shows up. We need to suppress those 3 buildings long enough to get our people out. I need volume of fire, controlled and accurate. Mark your targets. Conserve ammunition. Nobody dies here today. Clear. They answered as one. Clear, ma'am. And then the world became sound and fury, controlled chaos. The kind of violence that looked random but followed patterns older than warfare itself. Cass moved between positions, directing fire, calling adjustments, keeping her people focused. The Marines responded like instruments in an orchestra, each playing their part, trusting the conductor even when the music turned brutal. 3 minutes passed. 4. The medevac appeared on the horizon, rotors cutting through haze and heat. The pilot's voice came through tense but steady. This is Dustoff 3-2. I see your position. LZ is still hot. Copy that, Dustoff. We'll suppress until your wheel's up. Just get in and get out. Roger. The helicopter dropped fast, flared hard, touched down in a storm of dust and debris. Cass's Marines moved with practiced efficiency. Wounded first, KIA next, every second counted. She stayed at the perimeter, carbine up, eyes scanning the buildings where the enemy waited. 5 minutes. 6. 7. The last Marine loaded. The corpsman waved from the open door. "We're full. Go." Cass sprinted for the helicopter. Felt the concussion of an RPG impact behind her, close enough that the heat washed over her back. Felt hands grab her gear, haul her into the bay. The Black Hawk lifted, tilted, accelerated away from the compound as rounds cracked through the air where they'd been seconds before. Inside the helicopter, 9 wounded Marines and 4 flag-draped bodies. Captain Reeves breathing through a field-expedient airway. The sergeant with the leg wound giving her a nod that said more than words ever could. And Cass, sitting on the deck with her back against the bulkhead, knowing that she just ended her career to save 9 lives. That Admiral Hawthorne would make sure of it. That sometimes the right choice cost everything. But those 9 Marines would go home. Their families would see them again. And that, she thought as exhaustion finally hit her, was worth any price. What happens when you save 9 lives but lose your career? When you do everything right and get punished for it anyway? Cassandra Brennan was about to learn that victory and vindication were 2 very different things. The Black Hawk touched down at Kandahar Airfield 40 minutes after extracting the wounded from that compound. Medical teams swarmed the aircraft. Captain Reeves was rushed to surgery. The Marines with the leg wound went next. Cass climbed out last, covered in dust and someone else's blood, and found a full colonel waiting for her with an expression that promised nothing good. "Lieutenant Brennan, you're to report to the command center immediately." She followed him through the base, past tents and hardened structures, past groups of soldiers who stopped to watch her walk by. Word traveled fast in a war zone. She defied an admiral's direct order, saved a squad, made herself either a hero or a criminal depending on who you asked. The command center was air-conditioned, sterile, a stark contrast to the heat and chaos she'd left behind. Admiral Hawthorne sat at the head of a conference table, 3 stars on his collar, 40 years of service in his eyes, and something else, something cold and calculating that made Cass's skin crawl. He didn't stand when she entered, didn't offer the courtesy due a fellow officer, just looked at her like she was something unpleasant he'd found on his boot. "Lieutenant Brennan, do you understand why you're here?" "Yes, sir. Because I countermanded your order and conducted an unauthorized combat operation." The Admiral's jaw tightened. "You endangered your crew. You put a helicopter at risk. You violated the chain of command." "Sir, with respect, I saved 9 Marines who would have died waiting for armor support." "Respect," the Admiral repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "You want to talk about respect? You're a 26-year-old lieutenant with delusions of competence. You think because you went through some tactical officer program that you understand combat command. You think being a woman gives you the right to question orders from men who have been fighting wars since before you were born." The room went very quiet. Even the other officers present seemed to hold their breath. Cass stood at attention, eyes forward, jaw clenched. "Sir, my gender has nothing to do with tactical decision-making, doesn't it? Because from where I'm sitting, you're another affirmative action experiment who thinks she can play soldier. You got lucky today, Brennan. Those Marines lived because of luck, not skill. Next time, that luck runs out and American boys die because some girl thought she knew better than her commanding officer." He stood, walked around the table, stopped inches from her face. "I'm recommending you for court-martial. Disobeying a direct order in a combat zone. If I have my way, you'll spend the next 5 years in Leavenworth thinking about what happens when women try to be something they're not." Dismissed. Cass saluted, turned, walked out of that command center with her spine straight and her hands steady. But inside she was breaking, because she'd known this would happen, known that saving those lives would cost her everything, and she'd done it anyway. 3 days later, Captain Reeves regained consciousness. The field tracheotomy had saved his life. The sergeant with the leg wound would keep his leg. All 9 wounded Marines would recover. 4 families received flag-draped coffins, and the knowledge that their sons hadn't died alone in that compound. And Cassandra Brennan received orders to return stateside for disciplinary proceedings. The flight home was long. 36 hours of military transport, cargo holds, uncomfortable seats, too much time to think. She thought about her father, about Colonel Declan Brennan who'd led a rescue mission in Desert Storm that saved 40 soldiers, who'd been posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, who'd written in his journal, "Leadership isn't about being right, it's about being certain when others can't be." She thought about the M1911 pistol he'd carried, now sitting in a locked case in her apartment, about the legacy she'd tried to honor, about whether he'd be proud or ashamed of what she'd become. Naval Station San Diego looked the same as when she'd left. Palm trees and sunshine, sailors in white uniforms, the Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly blue, but everything felt different now. She was confined to base pending the court-martial, restricted from duty, assigned a military defense attorney who looked at her case file like it was a terminal diagnosis. "Lieutenant Brennan, I'm going to be honest with you. The Admiral's charges are serious. Disobeying a direct order, reckless endangerment, unauthorized combat operation. You're looking at a dishonorable discharge, possible prison time. What about the Marines I saved? That might help with sentencing, but it doesn't change the fact that you violated orders. Military law is clear on this." She spent 2 weeks in limbo, running in the mornings because it was the only thing that kept her sane, sitting in her apartment at night staring at her father's pistol, wondering if she'd made the right choice, wondering if he'd faced the same doubts before his last mission. The answer came from an unexpected source. A knock at her door at 2100 hours. She opened it to find a Marine in dress uniform. Older, weathered, with the kind of face that had seen too many wars. Master Sergeant Derek Matthews. They called him Bear, she'd learn later. He was a legend in the Corps. 30 years of service. 3 wars. More commendations than most officers earned in a lifetime. "Lieutenant Brennan," he said, "I served with your father in Desert Storm. I was there the day he died. May I come in?" She stepped aside. He entered, looked around her apartment, stopped at the M1911 in its case. "That's Declan's pistol. I'd recognize it anywhere. You look like him, you know. Same eyes. Same stubborn set to your jaw." She didn't know what to say to that. Bear turned to face her. "I heard what happened in Afghanistan. I read the after-action reports. I talked to Captain Reeves and that sergeant you pulled out. You did the right thing, Brennan. Your father would be proud. But the Admiral is going to destroy my career." "Maybe," Bear said, "or maybe this is just the beginning of a different kind of fight." "What do you mean?" He pulled out a folder from inside his jacket, handed it to her. Inside were documents, incident reports, testimony, names and dates going back years. "Admiral Hawthorne has a history, Brennan, a pattern of behavior toward women in uniform, harassment, assault, using his rank to protect himself. There are 7 women who filed complaints over the years, 7 complaints that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes, 7 careers ended while his continued." Cass stared at the documents. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you're going to fight back. Not just for yourself, but for every woman who came before you, for every woman who will come after. Your father fought for his soldiers in the desert. You're going to fight for yours in a courtroom, and I'm going to help you." The court-martial was set for 6 weeks out. 6 weeks to build a defense, to find those 7 women and convince them to testify, to prove that Admiral Hawthorne's vendetta wasn't about tactical decisions but about gender, to expose a pattern of abuse that the Navy had covered up for decades. It should have been impossible, but Bear was relentless. And Cass discovered something about herself in those 6 weeks. She was her father's daughter, and she didn't know how to quit. Can one moment change everything? Can a single action erase years of silence? The answer walked onto Naval Station Coronado on a Monday morning in dress blues, carrying nothing but resolve and the weight of 7 women's stories. Cassandra Brennan was done being quiet. The court-martial hearing room was designed to intimidate. Dark wood paneling, the Navy seal mounted on the wall, a panel of 5 senior officers behind an elevated bench. Admiral Hawthorne sat at the prosecution table, confident, almost bored, a man who'd been here before and knew how these things ended. Cass sat beside her defense attorney, Master Sergeant Matthews, in the gallery behind her. The charges were read. disobeying a direct order during combat operations, reckless endangerment of personnel and equipment, conduct unbecoming an officer. How do you plead? Not guilty. The prosecution went first, built their case methodically. The Admiral's order to hold position, Cass's refusal, the risk to the helicopter crew, the violation of chain of command. They called witnesses. The Black Hawk pilot who testified that yes, the LZ was hot, yes, Lieutenant Brennan had overridden the Admiral's order. They called tactical experts who said armor support should have been waited for. That proper procedure was compromised. By the end of day one, Cass looked guilty as charged. Her defense attorney stood, called Captain Reeves to the stand, the man she'd performed emergency surgery on in that Afghan compound. He'd flown back from Germany specifically to testify, still recovering, voice rough but certain. Captain, the attorney said, if Lieutenant Brennan had followed Admiral Hawthorne's order to hold position, what would have happened? We'd all be dead, every single one of us. The armor column arrived 23 minutes after Lieutenant Brennan extracted us. We had maybe 5 minutes of ammunition left. The insurgents were preparing to overrun our position. She didn't save 9 Marines. She saved 13. And you believe her decision was correct. I believe her decision was the only decision. She saw what needed to be done and she did it. That's what combat leaders do. The prosecutor objected, called it hearsay. The objection was overruled. The testimony stood. Then came the sergeant with the leg wound, the young Marine who'd held his tourniquet together with prayer, the corpsman who'd watched Cass perform a field tracheotomy with a pen and a knife. One by one, they testified. One by one, they said the same thing. Lieutenant Brennan saved our lives. By the end of day 2, the narrative was shifting. Not guilty became possible, but Cass's attorney wasn't done. He called a witness the prosecution hadn't expected. Commander Jennifer Whitmore, 46 years old, 24 years of service, currently serving on a destroyer in the Pacific Fleet. She took the stand in dress whites, every ribbon earned, every medal placed. She looked directly at Admiral Hawthorne as she was sworn in. The attorney approached. Commander Whitmore, do you know Admiral Hawthorne? Yes. Can you describe your first interaction with him? It was 19 years ago. I was a newly commissioned ensign assigned to his command. He called me into his office late one evening, said he wanted to discuss my career path. The room was very quiet now. And what happened? He propositioned me. When I refused, he became aggressive. He grabbed my arm, pushed me against the wall, told me that women in the Navy needed to understand their place, that if I wanted to advance, I needed to be more cooperative. Did you report this? I tried. Filed a formal complaint through my chain of command. The investigation went nowhere. The Admiral was protected. 3 months later, I was transferred to a desk job. My career effectively stalled for the next 8 years. The prosecution objected. Relevance. The defense attorney turned to the panel. Relevance is pattern of behavior, sir. This court-martial isn't just about one tactical decision in Afghanistan. It's about an admiral who has systematically targeted female officers who don't comply with his expectations. Commander Whitmore is the first of 7 witnesses who will testify to Admiral Hawthorne's decades-long history of abuse and retaliation. The objection was overruled. And over the next 3 days, 6 more women took the stand. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Kavanagh, assaulted during a deployment 17 years ago. Major Patricia Chen, Marine Corps, harassed and demoted 15 years ago. Captain Nicole Torres, driven out of the service 12 years ago, each with the same story. Admiral Hawthorne had abused his power, had targeted them, had buried their complaints, had ended their careers while his continued to flourish. By the time the 7th witness finished, Admiral Hawthorne's face was ashen. The panel of officers looked disturbed, and Cass understood that this had become something bigger than her court-martial. This was a reckoning. Her defense attorney called one final witness, Master Sergeant Derek Matthews. Bear took the stand like he owned it, 30 years of service radiating from every word. Sergeant Matthews, you served with Colonel Declan Brennan, Lieutenant Brennan's father, correct? Yes, sir. And you've reviewed the tactical situation in Afghanistan. I have. In your professional opinion, was Lieutenant Brennan's decision tactically sound? Absolutely. She assessed the situation, recognized that waiting for armor support would result in complete loss of the pin-down unit, and executed a high-risk extraction under fire. It was textbook combat leadership. Would Colonel Brennan have made the same decision, without hesitation? Declan Brennan spent his entire career putting soldiers' lives above regulations. He would have been proud of what his daughter did, because she didn't just save Marines that day. She proved that leadership isn't about gender. It's about courage under pressure. It's about making the hard call when everyone else is frozen. And if Admiral Hawthorne can't see that, then he has no business wearing a uniform. The prosecution had no cross-examination. What could they ask? The panel deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the lead officer stood. Lieutenant Cassandra Brennan, this panel finds you not guilty of all charges. Furthermore, we recommend Admiral Richard Hawthorne be investigated for multiple violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, including assault, harassment, obstruction of justice, and conduct unbecoming an officer. This panel recommends his immediate suspension pending formal investigation. The courtroom erupted. Cass sat very still, not quite believing it. Bear's hand landed on her shoulder, squeezed once. Behind her, the 7 women who testified were crying, hugging, finally vindicated after decades of silence. And at the prosecution table, Admiral Hawthorne stared straight ahead, his 40-year career crumbling around him. That evening, Cass stood on the beach at Coronado. The sun was setting, painting the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson. Bear found her there, handed her a beer, stood beside her in comfortable silence. "You did it," he finally said. "We did it. Those women did it. All I did was refuse to stay quiet. That's all it ever takes. One person willing to stand up. One person willing to say no more. What happens now?" "Now," Bear said, "you go back to work. You lead your Marines. You prove that today wasn't a fluke. You show the Navy that women can do this job as well as any man. Because 100 years from now, people will remember this day. They'll remember the lieutenant who stood up to an admiral, who exposed abuse, who changed policy. They'll remember Cassandra Brennan. She smiled, took a drink. And what will they say? That she was her father's daughter, that she kept the faith, that she never bowed. Never. How do you rebuild after everything burns down? How do you turn vindication into transformation? For Cassandra Brennan, the answer wasn't found in courtrooms or headlines. It was found in the quiet work of making sure no one else had to fight the battle she'd fought. 3 months after the court-martial, Admiral Hawthorne was convicted on 7 counts of assault, 3 counts of obstruction of justice, and conduct unbecoming an officer. He was sentenced to 17 years in Leavenworth Federal Prison, stripped of his rank, his pension, his legacy. 40 years of service erased by decades of abuse finally brought to light. The Navy announced sweeping reforms: independent oversight for assault complaints, mandatory reporting, protected status for whistleblowers, anonymous hotlines, cultural sensitivity training for all officers. The media called them the Brennan Protocols. Cass hated the name but couldn't argue with the results. She was promoted to full lieutenant, then lieutenant commander, assigned to Naval Special Warfare Command as a training officer. Her job was to prepare the next generation of combat leaders, to teach them tactics and strategy and the weight of command decisions, but mostly to teach them that honor mattered more than rank, that integrity wasn't negotiable, that speaking up was always worth the cost. The SEAL Training Center at Coronado was brutal by design. It broke most candidates. That was the point. You didn't want people who gave up when things got hard. You wanted warriors who pushed through impossible odds, who kept fighting when their bodies screamed to quit, who understood that the only easy day was yesterday. Cass stood on the beach during Hell Week, watching candidates struggle through surf torture. Cold Pacific water, endless physical punishment, sleep deprivation that rewrote your brain chemistry. Some quit. Many quit. But the ones who stayed, the ones who refused to ring the bell, those were the ones who became something extraordinary. A female candidate approached her after morning PT. 24 years old, from Texas, built like a fighter and twice as determined. Her name was Emma Graves. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead. Was it worth it? The court-martial, the investigation, everything you went through?" Cass thought about it. About 7 women who'd finally been heard. About Admiral Hawthorne serving 17 years. About policies that would protect the next generation. About her father's journal and the words that still guided her. Sometimes the right choice costs everything. Make it anyway. Ask me that question in 10 years, she said, when you're a commander and some admiral tries to tell you that women don't belong. Ask me when you defend yourself and don't lose your career because someone established precedent. Then you tell me if it was worth it. Graves smiled. Yes, ma'am. 6 months later, Cass received orders. Commander, Naval Special Warfare Group 3. The first woman to command a special warfare group. Bear called to congratulate her. Turns out standing up for yourself is good for your career after all. Sometimes, Cass said, but that's not why I did it. I know, that's why it worked. The promotion came with new responsibilities, bigger decisions, more lives depending on her judgment. She thought about that Afghan compound often. About the choice to disobey orders. About 9 Marines who went home because she'd trusted her instincts over authority. That decision had cost her everything and given her everything. All at once. Strange how life worked. She stood in her new office looking at the walls. Her commendations, her deployment photos, and in a place of honor, her father's M1911 pistol in a glass case. The plaque read, Colonel Declan Brennan, 75th Ranger Regiment, Desert Storm, 1991. Honor over everything. There was a knock at the door. A young lieutenant stood there, 23 years old, fresh from the academy, eyes bright with ambition and fear. Commander Brennan, I'm Lieutenant Rachel Kowalski. I was told to report to you for mentorship. Cass gestured to the chair. Come in. Tell me about yourself. The lieutenant started talking about qualifications, training, goals, standard new officer speech. Nervous but confident, ready to prove herself. Cass listened the way Bear had listened to her, the way her father would have listened if he'd lived, because this was the real victory, not the court-martial, not the policy changes, not even the promotion. The real victory was this young woman sitting in her office, knowing that if someone assaulted her, she could defend herself and not lose her career. Knowing that the institution would protect her instead of her attacker. Knowing that honor mattered more than rank. Lieutenant, Cass said when Kowalski finished, I'm going to teach you everything I know about being a warrior, about leadership, about standing up when it costs everything. But first I need you to understand something. Ma'am, this uniform doesn't make you inferior to anyone. Your gender doesn't make you weak. And if anyone ever tries to tell you otherwise, you have permission to prove them wrong. By the book, through excellence, and if necessary, through defensive force. She stood, extended her hand. Welcome to Special Warfare Group 3. Let's get to work. What does legacy mean? Is it the battles you win or the people you inspire? Is it the medals on your chest or the lives you change? Cassandra Brennan stood on the parade ground at Naval Station Coronado 1 year after the court-martial that changed everything. The same parade ground where witnesses had seen the impossible, where a lieutenant had stood her ground against an admiral, where one moment had shattered decades of silence. The sun was setting, painting everything in gold and shadow. She was alone. Wanted to be alone. This place held too many ghosts, too many memories, both beautiful and terrible. She thought about her father, about Colonel Declan Brennan, who died when she was 3 years old, who'd left nothing but a journal, a pistol, and a legacy of honor that seemed impossible to live up to, who'd chosen to save 40 soldiers in the desert and paid for it with his life, who'd written the words that still guided her. Leadership isn't about being right. It's about being certain when others can't be. She'd spent her whole career trying to honor him, to be worthy of his name, to prove that his daughter could carry forward what he'd started. And maybe, finally, she had. The investigation into Admiral Hawthorne had uncovered 39 years of abuse, 17 years of direct assaults, 22 years of harassment and retaliation, 7 formal complaints buried, 14 women's careers destroyed. The Navy had issued a formal apology, implemented new policies, created oversight committees, changed the culture slowly but surely. But the real change, Cass knew, wasn't in policies or committees. It was in moments like the one with Lieutenant Kowalski. In young women entering service, knowing they wouldn't have to fight the battles Cass had fought, knowing the institution would protect them, that they could focus on being warriors instead of constantly defending their right to be there. Emma Graves had graduated Hell Week, one of 4 women in her class to make it through. She was training now, preparing to become a SEAL, following in the footsteps of the commander who'd shown her that standing up was always worth the cost. Commander Whitmore had been promoted, so had 3 of the other women who'd testified. Their careers, stalled for decades, finally moving forward, finally recognized for the competence they'd always possessed. Admiral Hawthorne was in Leavenworth, 17 years. He'd lost everything: rank, pension, freedom, reputation. Some people said it was too harsh, that he'd served his country for 40 years, that one mistake shouldn't erase a lifetime of service, but Cass knew better. It wasn't one mistake. It was 39 years of systematic abuse, of using power to hurt people, of believing that rank meant immunity. Justice wasn't too harsh. It was finally, mercifully sufficient. Bear found her on the parade ground as darkness fell. The old Marine approached quietly, stood beside her, said nothing for a long time, just watched the sun disappear into the Pacific. Finally, he spoke. "Declan would be proud, you think. I know, you did what he did. You put honor above everything. You stood your ground when it cost everything. You proved that courage isn't about gender or rank or politics. It's about doing what's right when everyone else is afraid." Cass smiled, felt tears sting her eyes. She didn't wipe them away. "I couldn't have done it without you, without those women who testified, without Captain Reeves and that sergeant, without everyone who stood up when it mattered." "That's how it works," Bear said. "One person starts, others follow. Eventually the system changes. But it always starts with one person willing to say no more." "Is it over?" He shook his head. "This fight is never over. There will always be people who abuse power, who think rank means immunity, who believe that might makes right. But now there's precedent. There's proof that standing up works, that justice is possible. That's what you gave the Navy. That's your legacy." 3 months later, Cass testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee. Senator Patricia Murray asked the question everyone wanted answered. "Commander Brennan, do you believe military culture can change?" Cass thought about her father, about the M1911 pistol now sitting in her office, about the words engraved on its slide. "Senator, I believe warriors fight for what's right, not just on battlefields but in boardrooms and courtrooms and parade grounds. Culture changes when we demand it, when we refuse to accept that rank means immunity, when we stand up even when standing up costs everything. And was it worth it? What you sacrificed?" "I didn't sacrifice anything, ma'am. I defended myself. The Navy sacrificed its integrity by protecting Admiral Hawthorne for 39 years. What happened on that parade ground wasn't a sacrifice. It was a reckoning." The hearing ended with applause, rare in Washington, rarer still in military testimony. That night Cass drove to Arlington National Cemetery, Section 60, her father's grave. She'd been there 3 times before, once when she graduated from the academy, once when she made captain, once after the court-martial. Now she came as a lieutenant commander, as the woman who'd exposed systemic abuse and changed Navy policy, as her father's daughter. She knelt at the headstone, placed her hand on the cold marble. "I kept the faith, Dad. I didn't bow, just like you taught me." The wind moved through the trees. Somewhere a bugle played taps for another fallen warrior. Cass closed her eyes and let herself feel it. The weight of legacy, the pride of honor, the cost of standing when everyone else kneeled. Bear approached quietly, knelt beside her. They sat in silence for a long time. "Declan would say you surpassed him," Bear finally said. "He'd say I honored what he started. That's enough." "Is it? Because you're not done yet, not by a long shot." "What do you mean?" Bear smiled. "You've got 30 years left in uniform. 30 years to make sure what happened to you, to those 7 women, never happens again. 30 years to train the next generation, to change the culture, to build the Navy your father would have wanted." He stood, extended his hand. "You ready for that fight?" Cass took his hand, stood, looked at her father's grave one more time. Then she turned toward the future. "Ready." 1 year later, Lieutenant Commander Cassandra Brennan stood in her office at Naval Special Warfare Group 3. Lieutenant Kowalski had just left after a training session. Emma Graves was graduating SEAL qualification training next month. Commander Whitmore had been assigned to a carrier group, finally commanding at sea after 20 years of being sidelined. The 7 women who'd testified were scattered across the fleet, their careers thriving, their voices finally heard. The Brennan protocols were working. Assault complaints were being investigated properly. Whistleblowers were protected. The culture was changing, slowly but surely. Cass stood at her window looking out at Coronado Beach, the same beach where she'd stood after the court-martial, where Bear had told her that people would remember this day 100 years from now. She didn't know if that was true, didn't really care. What mattered was that right now, today, young women could enter service without fear, could focus on being warriors instead of constantly fighting for their right to exist, could defend themselves without losing everything. That was enough. That was everything. She looked at her father's pistol in its case, at the plaque that read honor over everything, thought about the journal entry that still guided her. Sometimes the right choice costs everything. Make it anyway. Thought about an Afghan compound and 9 Marines who went home because she'd trusted her instincts over orders. Thought about 7 women who'd finally been heard after decades of silence. Thought about Emma Graves and Rachel Kowalski and every woman who'd come after, standing on foundations built from courage and sacrifice, and the refusal to accept that rank meant immunity. The parade ground where it all started was empty now, the sun setting over Coronado, the ocean wind carrying salt and possibility. Cass stood there alone, remembering. 1,200 witnesses had seen one moment, one punch, one stand, but what they'd really witnessed was the end of silence, the beginning of accountability, the moment the Navy learned that honor mattered more than rank and justice mattered more than reputation. Admiral Hawthorne was in Leavenworth now, serving his sentence. 7 victims had their voices heard, policies had changed, lives had been protected, and a young woman from Texas named Emma Graves was training to be a SEAL, following in the footsteps of the commander who'd shown her that standing up was always worth the cost. Cass walked off the parade ground as the sun touched the horizon. Behind her, the place where she'd thrown one punch and changed everything. Ahead of her, 30 years of service, 30 years of training warriors, 30 years of making sure the next generation knew that honor wasn't negotiable. Her father had chosen honor in the desert and saved 40 lives. She'd chosen honor on a parade ground and saved 7 careers. The legacy continued. The fight wasn't over. But for tonight, it was enough to know she'd done what her father taught her. She'd stood her ground, she'd kept the faith, and she hadn't bowed, not then, not ever. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. Sometimes courage looks like disobedience. Sometimes the right choice costs everything. And sometimes one person willing to stand changes the world for everyone who comes after. That's not heroism, that's honor. And honor, Cassandra Brennan had learned, was the only legacy that mattered, the only one that lasted, the only one worth fighting for. Everything else was just noise. Just rank and medals and words that meant nothing if integrity was missing. Her father had known that, had lived it, had died for it. And now his daughter carried it forward, not because she was trying to be a hero, but because when the moment came, when the choice was clear, she'd done what warriors have always done. She'd stood her ground. She protected her people, and she'd proven that honor, real honor, didn't recognize gender or rank or politics. It only recognized truth. And truth, in the end, was all that mattered.